In the mid-1990s, Amtrak, the national passenger rail operator of the United States, embarked on an ambitious proposal to overcome one of the largest and most notorious bottlenecks in its long-distance intercity operations, that being the necessity to terminate its services at terminals in Chicago without there being a direct run-through coast-to-coast train. The scheme would overcome an issue endemic of the fact that Amtrak had been formed through the passenger rail operations of various different rival companies which had little to no compatibility, each operating to different terminal stations and along differing routes that didn't allow for the possibility of future cohesion. But despite much promise, logistical issues with the interlining of these long-distance cross-country services would ultimately see the scheme scrapped before it ever truly began, with the problems faced in the 1990s still present today. Chicago, as the largest city in the Midwest United States, had long been the ideal hub and terminus for many of America's most notable eastern and western railroads, with companies such as the Santa Fe, New York Central, Pennsylvania Railroad, and Milwaukee Road all serving terminal stations in the city that were usually shared with other operators, as per Dearborn Station, which was shared between the Santa Fe, Chesapeake and Ohio, Erie Railroad, and Wabash, while LaSalle Street was shared between the Rock Island, New York Central, and Nickel Plate Railroads. For cross-country travel, through tickets could be purchased from one company to another, such as the New York Central to the Santa Fe, and were organized through clearinghouses, though despite the logistical efficiencies of operating coast-to-coast passenger services, the closest these operations would come would be with through coaches via Chicago and Kansas City, such as coaches being interchanged between the 20th Century Limited and the Broadway Limited, with the Super Chief and City of San Francisco among others. This situation would remain the same right up until the formation of Amtrak in 1971, which took on a majority of America's passenger railroad operations from the ailing mainstream carriers, but was also saddled with the logistical challenge of having to terminate all of its services from the east and west coasts at Chicago, with the exception of a few trains that traveled to different destinations, such as the National Limited, which ran to Kansas City, Missouri from New York and Washington, D.C., despite the fact that each of the intersecting passenger operations now belonged to the same company. Instead, the only dedicated coast-to-coast service would be the Sunset Limited from Miami, Florida to Los Angeles, California, which extended the trade of Southern Pacific heritage from its original terminus at New Orleans through to Florida in April 1993, though from November 1996, the service would be cut back to Sanford, Florida, in order to allow for better maintenance arrangements at Amtrak's Auto Train Depot, before being re-extended to Orlando in October 1997. By 1991, Amtrak's 20th year of operation, the company found itself both more confident and more constrained than it had been at its first founding 2 decades earlier, with the route map having settled into a pattern broadly recognizable today, and the roster of overnight trains included 44 out-and-back named services, including the Crescent, the Texas Eagle, the Coast Starlight, the Empire Builder, and the California Zephyr among them. Yet ridership hovered stubbornly at around 20 million passengers a year, a figure that had not greatly shifted despite the improvements of the W. Graham Claytor Jr. era. While moreover, the system remained financially fragile, living year to year on the strength of federal appropriations, never entirely certain what level of support Congress might be prepared to grant. Claytor's hope was that by pursuing incremental efficiencies, tighter cost controls, modest expansions of the fleet, and the cultivation of state partnerships to support corridor services, Amtrak could at least move towards covering its operational costs, and among these proposals was the concept of overriding the ever-present bottleneck of the Chicago area by providing for the first time dedicated run-through trains that went beyond the previous system of through coaches and ticket connections. For passengers, it promised fewer misconnections, fuller trains, and a smoother, less fragmented journey across the continent, while for Amtrak itself, it symbolized a determination to think creatively within constraints, to respond to the perennial shortage of capital with ingenuity, and to make the case that passenger rail still had a place in the American landscape. Much of the dilemma faced by Amtrak was the strain of its long-distance rolling stock, with the superliner fleet, introduced from the late 1970s, having modernized Western trains such as the Southwest Chief, California Zephyr, and Empire Builder, though the East continued to depend on older, rebuilt single-level stock, including a motley selection of Amfleet cars from the 1970s and heritage coaches from the pre-Amtrak era that had been refurbished but were increasingly showing their age. This imbalance meant that certain routes struggled to cover their equipment cycles, as car utilization in the West was relatively efficient, while Eastern services juggled life-expired vehicles, frequent shopping for heavy maintenance, and sporadic shortages of sleepers and diners, and by coupling a Western superliner service with an Eastern one, the same train set could cover 2 long runs, saving an entire consist and smoothing the peaks and troughs of the rotation. In an era when Amtrak was perpetually short of sleeping cars, coaches, and dining cars, this was no small consideration, as a single set taken out of the spare ratio could free capacity for seasonal surges, reduce the number of expensive deadhead moves, and give mechanical departments a little more breathing room between mandated inspections and overhauls. There was also the question of passenger convenience, with Chicago being Amtrak's great hub, but it was also a choke point where platform capacity, yard leads, and timekeeping all conspired to make connections fragile, with a misconnection in Chicago potentially resulting in a wasted day or more if an onward train had already departed and passengers were left with no choice but an overnight stay in a hotel. For example, a through service between the Capital Limited and the Southwest Chief removed that risk altogether by binding the schedules into a single product and guaranteeing the handover inside the same physical consist, with the ability for passengers to remain in the same accommodation across the Chicago layover being initially touted as part of the plan, even if in practice this proved unworkable because trains had to be turned, watered, cleaned, and provisioned, and access for commissary, fuel, and sanitary servicing required the consist to be off the platform and under the control of the yard. Still, the notion of being able to board in Washington and remain in the same berth until Los Angeles had obvious appeal, especially at a time when Amtrak was trying to sell long-distance travel as both transportation and experience, promising a one-seat ride that removed the nagging uncertainty of a cross-hub change with luggage in tow. The choice of trains to link was dictated by geography and schedule as much as by rolling stock type, with Capital Limited and Southwest Chief being often paired in planning documents, as their timings allowed a lengthy but workable pause in Chicago for servicing, crew changes, and inspections without completely inverting the crew-base diagram. Other possibilities, meanwhile, included linking the Capital Limited with the Empire Builder, though this fell foul of excessively tight timings that left little margin for delay east of Toledo or west of Milwaukee, while the Lakeshore Limited and California Zephyr posed logistical challenges of backing moves in and out of Union Station throat tracks and competing for scarce slots on the busy approaches. Similarly, superliners could not run into New York or Boston because of clearance constraints, limiting the theoretical compatibility of the eastern destinations, and even where paths existed, host railroading dispatching priorities, winter weather risks on the eastern leg, and federal hours of service limits for operating crews all pushed the plan towards pairings that offered the widest recovery windows and the least complex switching. Behind these operational calculations sat a broader portfolio of motives, with budget pressure encouraging any initiative that could reduce layover idle time and shorten the spare pool, and the mail and express era added incentives to keep consists moving rather than sitting on stub tracks awaiting their next turn, while marketing departments could badge a through train as a quasi-transcontinental journey without the cost of introducing a brand new service, and mechanical and depot managers appreciated the predictability of a fixed run-through pattern that created standard work packages in Chicago. At the same time, detractors worried about compounding lateness, with the fragility introduced by stringing two very long routes together, and the difficulty of protecting a through promise on days when one segment was severely delayed, with those risks ultimately reasserting themselves as the 1990s wore on, though in the early to mid-decade, the run-through concept emerged above all as a pragmatic attempt to stretch limited resources, simplify passenger journeys across the Chicago hub, and buy reliability through better equipment utilization rather than sheer fleet expansion. Nevertheless, the Capital Limited and the Southwest Chief, giving a Washington to Los Angeles through journey, was marketed for a short period between 1997 and 1998 as a through service, with passengers theoretically able to remain aboard during the layover in Chicago, though in practice, the idea proved far less workable than it had appeared, because the apparent simplicity of same train, same seat collided with the messy realities of station layout, railway operations, fleet condition, and the fragility of long-distance timekeeping. One difficulty lay in the handling of trains at Chicago Union Station, with most services from the west arriving head-on to the stub-end platforms and then being drawn out, turned on a Y or loop, and serviced before any eastward continuation, with this geometry making true run-through operation awkward even before the consideration of cleaning, watering, and inspections. The concept of allowing passengers to remain aboard during the layover quickly collapsed because the train had to be shunted to the yard for turning and servicing, a process that involved isolating hotel power, moving equipment through non-public areas and bringing on cleaners, mechanics and caterers, none of which was compatible with keeping passengers aboard for several hours, and even supervised access raised safety and liability issues, leading to passengers having to detrain anyway, thus evaporating the central selling point of a seamless one-seat ride. Another obstacle was punctuality, as Amtrak's long-distance trains in the 1990s were already struggling with timekeeping for reasons ranging from freight interference to weather and infrastructure constraints, and the through operation risked compounding these delays, with a late-arriving Southwest chief imperiling the timely departure of the Capital Limited and vice versa, creating a cascade in which one day's delay contaminated the next day's operation. While Amtrak might have held a connection for a reasonable period, it could not hold an entire eastbound departure for many hours without disrupting hundreds of passengers, crew bookings, and the schedules of onward connections along the line, and thus, in effect, the supposed guarantee of a coast-to-coast connection was illusory, and the only way to guarantee it would be to build excessive layover time in the Chicago schedule, which undermined the time competitiveness of the journey and consumed platform and yard capacity at the busiest long-distance hub. The question of equipment and servicing also weighed heavily, as aside from the aforementioned issue of superliner compatibility with eastern terminals in New York and Boston, thus meaning the only feasible partner for a superliner train was another superliner train such as the Capital Limited once it had been re-equipped, the longer the train set was kept in motion without a proper maintenance window, the greater the risk of mechanical faults accumulating. Chicago functioned as a crucial servicing base where carriages could be swapped, defects corrected, and catering stores replenished, and attempting to push trains through with only a cursory stop put extra strain on a fleet that was already stretched thin, while winter would exacerbate this, as snow, ice, and sub-zero temperatures in the Midwest and around Lake Michigan drove up failure rates for doors, HVAC, and toilets, and a run-through consist leaving Chicago with unresolved minor issues could quickly become an unreliable traveling headache 2 time zones away. Operational detail added further friction, with crew districts, rest rules, and labor agreements being built around Chicago as a hard boundary, with operating crews, onboard service staff, and mechanical personnel all having planned reliefs and lodging there, and changing those patterns would have required renegotiation, extra spare crews, and new rostering that introduced costs without unlocking commensurate revenue. Catering and commissary logistics were similarly Chicago-centric, with diners and cafes being provisioned to run to Chicago, not beyond, and rewriting those cycles for a handful of through passengers was hardly efficient, while even baggage handling and express traffic, which in that era still mattered on some trains, were organized around a break and resort in Chicago, while layering on top of that the compatibility concerns such as head-end power loading, different maintenance states between consists, and occasional mismatches in car counts or amenities, and the tidy link to trains concept started to look operationally brittle. Track capacity outside Chicago was another headache, as both the approaches to Union Station and the initial territories east and west of Chicago could be congested, and the pathing of long, heavy, long-distance consists out of one host railway and straight onto another on a precise time would have been difficult when freight railroads controlled dispatching and often prioritized their own movements. If the departing slot east of Chicago was missed because the inbound western train had arrived even an hour or two late, the knock-on could be a much larger delay as the train waited to be threaded between freights, and though this would be tolerable when there was a clean break between 2 separate services and the second could depart independently, it was much less tolerable when the two had been fused. Finally, there was the matter of demand and revenue, as although rail enthusiasts and a subset of leisure travelers were understandably keen on the romance of a true transcontinental train, the broader market signal was muted, as most passengers found it acceptable to change at Chicago, and many welcomed the chance to stretch their legs, get a proper meal off the train, or even spend a few hours in the city before boarding the next service. The pool of people intent on staying in the same compartment for 3 or more days was very small, and from a yield management perspective, tying up a scarce sleeping car room for such a long continuous run could depress revenue, because that room might otherwise turn over to a second high-yield booking after cleaning in Chicago, and thus the operational complications and reliability risks were borne by everyone, while the concrete benefit accrued to a relatively tiny group of through passengers could be accommodated almost as well with a robust protected connection and assistance if misconnection occurred. Taken together, the geometries and safety realities of Chicago operations, the tendency of delays to cascade, the loss of a proper maintenance window, the constraints of superliner deployment, crew and catering logistics built around a Chicago break, tight track capacity and the thinness of true through demand, meant the scheme lacked a sustainable foundation, and what looked attractive in a brochure proved brittle on the ground, and once the promise of staying aboard during the layover disappeared, so did most of the product's differentiation. For all these reasons, the run-through experiment was quietly wound down before the end of the decade, and by the early 2000s, Amtrak had reverted to emphasizing well-timed, well-protected connections in Chicago, rather than attempting to make coast-to-coast trains a daily reality. To summarize, the run-through proposal of Amtrak was an interesting attempt by the national passenger rail operator to overcome a pre-existing obstacle that had been carried over from the fragmented development of the original railroads and their stance of competition between the individual companies that was ultimately found to be not conducive under the unified system. Sadly, Amtrak's own inefficiencies, combined with the rigid arrangements of maintenance, equipment rosters, worker shifts, and other important operational elements, meant that, in practice, the company could not have possibly been able to carry out such a situation of run-through trains efficiently or effectively, thus meaning the situation remains today that coast-to-coast train travel across the United States remains an unrealized dream.